Welcome to Tiny Show and Tell Us, the bonus series where you write in with your favorite science news or factoid, we read your email aloud, and then dive deeper. I'm Sam Jones, and I'm here with my co-host, Deboki Chakravarti.
Hi, Sam. I'm excited. Last time we talked about squirrelpox, which I had never heard about.
Me either.
We also talked about tin buttons during the Napoleonic Wars. So we covered a lot. So if you want to help us keep covering more, please write to us to be featured in these episodes. You can email tinymatters@acs.org, or you can fill out the form linked in the episode description with your tiny show and tell us. So let's get started.
Yeah.
I can get us going today. I have the story from listener Neil, who writes, "It rains diamonds on Saturn.
Ooh.
It's due to the high concentration of methane in its atmosphere," which I read that and I was like, that's great. Stunning. Shout out to Saturn. That sounds really cool. But there is the question of, is this true?
Yes.
And that is a little bit more in question, but there are some really cool facets to this, and there is a way in which it is true, but just not for Saturn. So we're going to start with Saturn. We're going to talk about what its atmosphere is like. And I just want to start with this line from the European Space Agency because it's kind of rude. They wrote, "Saturn's atmosphere, although similar to Jupiter's, is much less interesting to look at from a distance."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some shade.
Yeah, Saturn can't help it. But if you were going to take a trip to Saturn, you'd be dealing with some really intense wind. There have been winds that go around 1,800 kilometers per hour at the equator, which is around 1,118.5 miles per hour.
Wow.
So very fast.
Fast.
Very. I don't know that converting it really made it any more manageable to me to process how fast that is. It just sounds terrible.
Yeah.
When we talk about where the weather happens, we're talking about what's called the troposphere. And in Saturn, the troposphere, the temperatures range from minus 130 degrees Celsius to positive 80 degrees Celsius. So that is a huge range. There's a layer of ammonia clouds and then a layer of ammonium hydrosulfate clouds as you go down. And then at the lowest level, there is a layer of water clouds. And most of the atmosphere is hydrogen and helium. So there's hydrogen gas that transitions to liquid hydrogen as the pressure goes up. And then underneath that is liquid helium, which is heavier. But there are trace amounts of other things like water ice. And to go back to what Neil wrote in, there is methane, but there is not necessarily a lot of it. There are just what they call trace amounts. So where does this story of diamond rain on Saturn come from? So Tien, our researcher who's super helpful, she found this BBC story from 2013. And according to the story, researchers looking at atmospheric data reported at the American Astronomical Society that their results showed that there are these lightning storms on Saturn that can turn methane into soot. And then as the soot falls, it turns into graphite. And then as it keeps falling, there's that pressure, it keeps building up. Graphite will then turn into diamonds.
So it just gets smushed. It essentially gets smushed into a diamond.
Exactly. And so they reported that the biggest diamonds could be about a centimeter wide, I guess. So that's pretty big, I think, by diamond standards.
That's actually really big. I feel like that could, depending on how fast it's going, that could kill someone.
Oh,
for
absolutely.
Sure.
I mean, if the wind's not going to kill you, the diamond rain could.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking hey, why don't we just go to Saturn and harvest these diamonds? There's a lot of problems with that plan. But one of them is that the diamonds end up melted by the hot core of Saturn so that it just gets melted into the liquid sea. So they based their results on temperature and pressure predictions for Saturn. But the very, very important caveat for this is that this work was presented at a conference and it wasn't peer reviewed. And we haven't found any articles or papers since then that supports this idea, shows hey, we really, really think that Saturn rains diamonds.
Right.
And at the time that these articles were coming out, some of the researchers in this field who were being interviewed about it to ask their thoughts about it, some were skeptical. They just said there's not enough data yet to support this idea that we're getting diamonds on Saturn.
Interesting.
However, one of the reasons that the researchers thought that Saturn and Jupiter, which is the other planet they thought could do this, might have diamond rain is because there are planets in our solar system that we do think probably do make diamond rain, with more good reason. And these are Uranus and Neptune. They are mostly made up of water, ammonia, and importantly, methane.
So a lot more methane than what you would find on Saturn.
I think so. That's my understanding based on what I'm reading. And so people have suspected that these planets have had diamond rain for like a while. Like I think this goes back decades because of those components and because of the fact that the planets get hot and dense as you go deeper into them, which again is great for breaking up methane and releasing carbon that can eventually, as it's descending into the planet and getting more pressure, can turn into diamonds. And so the diamonds likely drop into the mantle, get vaporized, and then cycle through. So they have like a diamond cycle, I guess, the way we have a water cycle, which is really cool.
That is really interesting.
Yeah. And so researchers actually wanted to see if this is possible because like we can't go to Uranus and Neptune and like see the diamond rains yet. So they tried to kind of reconstruct the planet conditions on Earth. And so one way they did this is using super powerful lasers that can mimic having high temperature and pressure. And they shot them at styrofoam and found it can make tiny little diamonds.
What?
They chose styrofoam because I guess it kind of behaves similarly to methane, but it's easier to handle, obviously.
Whoa. Is there now going to be like a side, like styrofoam derived diamonds enterprise?
Yeah. So they were tiny, like they were tiny little nano diamonds, they said. So I think you have to like really, really keep that laser going. And I'm guessing it's expensive.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But it does suggest that diamond rain might be real, but just not on Saturn.
That is so interesting. Yeah. And these are kind of the stories that I love when listeners write in. I mean, I love a lot of the things that listeners send to us, but Neil, I super appreciate this because it allowed us to go on this deep dive and uncover the research that was saying this.
Yeah.
But then ask a lot of questions about like, okay, so what have we learned since? Or like, is there disagreement in the field? And it sounds like there definitely is. And the fact that there isn't another publication about this makes it seem like, maybe not with Saturn, but it is cool to know that diamond rain in all likelihood does exist in our solar system.
Yeah. And you just like, it's like.
Sounds beautifully painful.
I mean, yeah. Like, oh man, like it's so cool. Like what conclusions we jump to knowing certain things. Like if you had told me, oh, there's a methane filled atmosphere in a hot, dense planet, I wouldn't have been like, oh, I know what that's going to lead to, diamond rain. But someone was sitting there and was like, I think this is what happens.
Yeah.
For good reasons.
Totally. I think it's so interesting, sort of the breakdown from soot to graphite to diamond and sort of like thinking about that trajectory is also really interesting.
For sure.
Cool. Well, thank you, Neil. That was fun. All right. So I have a tiny show and tell us from listener Tanya, who wrote in saying, UV degradation can break down harmful residual dyes from plastic pollution. Interesting. Lot to unpack there. So first, let's talk about UV or ultraviolet rays. So typically we think of the sun, but UV light can also be produced artificially, typically in industry and commerce. And I feel like if you've ever been to like a nail salon, you've seen the UV lights that are used to harden gel polish.
Right.
So it's a lot of places, but it's mainly our sun. So UV rays, if we think about the light spectrum, UV rays cover the wavelength range of 100 to 400 nanometers. So that is lower wavelength-wise than visible light. So it goes like from low to high, UV, visible, and then infrared. Again, this is simplified. So within UV, though, you have UVA, which is on the higher end, 315 to 400 nanometers, UVB, which is just below that, 280 to 315, and then UVC, which is the lowest. It's 100 to 280 nanometers. And so as sunlight is passing through the atmosphere, most of the UVB, it's estimated around 90%, and all of the UVC is absorbed by ozone, as well as water vapor, and I guess oxygen and carbon dioxide. So a lot of the UV light is not reaching us on Earth, and that's a really good thing. We should be very grateful for our ozone for a number of reasons.
For sure.
But yeah, so UVA radiation is less affected by the atmosphere. So most of the UV radiation that we are getting that's reaching us is UVA, a little UVB.
Okay.
So let's talk about these residual dyes. I'm like breaking it into parts here.
Yep.
So that's what Tanya wrote in about, were these residual dyes. So there's definitely an ongoing effort to eliminate dyes from bodies of water because they have been shown to negatively impact aquatic organisms and could cause cancer in people depending on the dye. I'm going to list some dyes, but like, no, this is not a one size fits all. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. If you see this dye on something, don't like lose your mind thinking it's going to give you cancer or destroy the environment. But these are considered pollutants. So they're not good, but like I don't want anyone to overreact and freak out.
Yeah.
So eosin Y, methyl orange, phenol red, orange G, bromomethol blue, crystal violet, 4-nitrophenol, rhodamine B, Congo red, methylene blue, and malachite green. Deboki, do any of those mean anything to you?
I feel like some of them sound familiar.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I read them, because I was like, I've read about these in different contexts and I couldn't place them all. But one that stood out to me that I was like, I feel like I've heard about methylene blue. Turns out it's used for a ton of things. Mm-hmm. So it can be used to visualize tissues in human patients. It's used to treat something called methemoglobinemia. Mm-hmm. That is a mouthful, which is a condition where red blood cells can't effectively deliver oxygen. And also, methylene blue is an antidote for cyanide poisoning. And I think that's where I learned about it. So I'm really going off on a bit of a tangent right now, which we do on these episodes.
How did they find that? Like, they were just like, this person is dealing with cyanide poisoning. We're going to...
I don't know. I'm sure there's like something. I didn't investigate it further, but I'm like, this is such a...
Did we talk about this with the Poisoner's Handbook?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Yes. So I feel like I read this or we talked about it in the episode that was on early forensic toxicology, where we talk about arsenic, we talk about cyanide. So I came across it at some point. But anyways, so like methylene blue, it's not usually used as a coloring agent in plastics, but it does apparently adsorb, meaning it sticks to plastic and accumulates.
Okay.
And it can react really, really poorly with certain psychiatric medications. And so that's like a big concern for it just being out and about.
Right.
So can UV rays break down dyes? Yes, but it's complicated. So for years, scientists have known that dyes and pigments will experience light-induced degradation or photodegradation, but the chemistry behind that process is really varied and complex. And also, very important to note, although you may get some harmful dyes that degrade with UV exposure to become less harmful compounds, that same UV exposure can also cause the plastic that they might be in or on to break down into smaller plastics. So we're talking microplastics, nanoplastics. And because of that, like in some of the research Tian was finding, people were saying like, once you get to that point, if you're thinking about UV degradation that's good for degrading dyes, like you're also then you have this contradicting thing that's going on with plastics breaking down. And you have these micro and nanoplastics that then get into our water and our food supply.
Right.
Also, of course, keep in mind that the type of plastic and how thick it is plays a role. Same with, how much UV exposure it's getting.
Right.
So there does seem to be research on using photocatalysis in combination with UV light to break down dyes for wastewater treatment. So what that means is essentially using materials that, when they're exposed to light, will speed up that chemical reaction that breaks them down. So according to a review that Tian found, during photocatalysis, up to 80 to 90% of pigments can be removed from wastewater without the use of additional chemicals, which I thought was very interesting. But again, they're also like really optimizing this for different temperatures and pH and light intensity and other variables like under strict control that might be really hard to make happen if you're just thinking about like a random wastewater treatment environment.
Right.
So there's a lot of progress that needs to happen for this process to be turned into something that can be used on a large scale to remove harmful dyes from wastewater. And again, this doesn't address the issue of UV rays breaking down plastics into more harmful little pieces. So there's a trade-off. It seems really like the actual chemistry behind the breakdown of dyes is so complicated. And it also is really varied because depending on the dye, like it's going to change.
Yeah.
But it's cool to think about using something that we get from the sun to break down dyes that are not good for people or good for the environment. But I think because we've just like messed up our waterways so badly with plastic, then you have this sort of trade-off where it's like,
you just end up having to like think about so many trade-offs and just the pros and the cons.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know how to like say it more eloquently because it's just like it seems so complicated to figure out how we deal with, the results of the things that we make.
Yeah, absolutely. But I did think this was really interesting. So thank you for writing in, Tanya. I think it is true. UV degradation definitely can break down some harmful residual dyes from plastic pollution. But it can also contribute to plastic pollution. Yeah. So it's like, I don't know. We need to just stop with the plastic. And we don't have to think about either of these things as much.
Plastic is like our recurring foe on Tiny Matters. It just keeps coming.
Yeah, there's like a handful of things that I feel like we come back to. And it's like nanoplastic, microplastic,
right,
PFAS world. I feel like it just comes back to it so frequently.
I know. Yeah. I think when we recorded that episode, I didn't expect it to be the one that we would like be able to keep referencing. But I wonder, like, I feel like in a year or two, we're going to have to make an update about PFAS. And, like,
I think so. I feel like there's more and more research coming out. So I feel like by this time next year, I'm like, I think we're going to know more about impact on people, which is like causation as opposed to just linking. Because at this point, it's really linking. Yeah. Linking it to health impacts. But anyway, well, that's fun. Not fun. But it's really interesting. And I love diving into this kind of stuff. Thanks to Tanya and Neil for submitting to Tiny Show and Tell Us, a bonus episode from Tiny Matters created by the American Chemical Society and produced by Multitude. And a big thank you to science journalist Tien Nguyen, who did research for this episode.
You can send us an email to be featured in a future Tiny Show and Tell Us episode at tinymatters@acs.org. Or you can fill out the form that's linked in the episode description. We'll see you next time.